Hi, Marta.
Hi Ryan. How are
Hi,
you?
how are you?
So we managed to connect.
Yes.
Yes, it's great to have you on board. And I've just learned that you're calling in from Tennessee.
Yeah, that's
We
correct.
have quite an international audience, and also a lot of participants are joining from other places. So I think it would be really interesting from our participants to learn from you how you're dealing with the time difference.
Okay.
So
Sure.
what time is it now in Tennessee?
Right now it's 11 a.m. So I guess you all are probably just finishing up the day.
Yes.
Yeah. So sorry about that, and I'm happy that some people are here. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Yeah, so welcome to all the participants, all the people who are attending this session. We have really interesting topic and also something that a lot of you have been confronted with during these days. So I'm really happy that we can have this session on how we can collaborate better remotely. We also have some of the mentors I've learned who will join this call. So welcome from those who are attending online, and also welcome to those who are here with us in the studio. So we have a great speaker, Ryan van Winkle from Sprintbase. Many of you might be familiar with Sprintbase by now. It's a tool that we are using during this event and that we have been used also in several past events. So we are really glad that we have the opportunity to have Ryan with us also in person to talk about his experience with the platform and his personal experience working in a remote team. So maybe to start with, you want to briefly introduce yourself for our audience and tell us a bit about you, your background, and what you're up to.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Marta. So yeah, my name is Ryan Van Winkle. I'm calling in from Tennessee, in the southeast of the United States. So more or less where I'm from. But I'm typically closer to you all over, and I typically spend my time between Milan and in London, where our headquarters are. Uh, I've I've spent my entire career pretty much doing design and innovation work, working at a couple of consultancies. So I started off in the United States working for an innovation and change management company. I decided that I wanted to study innovation a bit more formally, as my undergraduate degree is actually in finance. So then I decided to do graduate school in Europe, where I came over to Milan and Politecnico, and I also studied a bit in Brussels at Solvay, studying innovation management. And then from there, I joined the team at Treehouse Innovation and Sprintbase, where we do a lot of design and innovation work for companies, both in person, kind of business as usual, and as you all are aware and will come into, doing a lot of that remotely now using Sprintbase, which is our design thinking platform.
Yes, great. Also, a lot of changes in your career so far, from finance to design thinking. It's quite a big leap that
Yeah,
you took, I guess.
yeah. Let's say I didn't always have it figured out. We can say that, to say the least.
Yeah. Okay,
Mhm.
cool. So we just wanted to hear a couple of words about Sprintbase. So I have someone who is turning my slides. It's not very responsive back there. Uh, so yeah, can you give us a couple of words for those who are online who maybe are not familiar with the platform yet? So what's Sprintbase?
Yeah, sure. Happy to do that. So Sprintbase is a pro grade innovation platform that's built around the design thinking process. So I'm not sure how many have used it, but kind of the big differences in Sprintbase is that, again, it's very structured around a process, and it has a lot of built-in guidance and structure and automated workflow, as well as things like instant documentation to help remote teams, tackling big strategic projects, to stay on track as they're collaborating, to kind of go start to finish through the innovation journey. And my role at Sprintbase is I primarily work with a lot of our partners and coaches. So we initially created the Sprintbase platform and used it internally with our clients. And then after a few years, we we said this probably isn't the right move. We should help other people to do this kind of work well remotely. So I get to work with a lot of different, great people, like the people at InnoDays, and helping them to run different kinds of training programs or strategic design projects, or high potential leadership programs, using the platform to help the remote teams move through the innovation process.
And from my experience of knowing Sprintbase and the Sprintbase team, what's really striking is that you help a lot of people with innovation projects, but you're also a very innovative organization yourself. And yeah, I want to show some people here. So here are a lot of the great guys and girls who are behind Sprintbase. And I've learned something unique about Sprintbase as an organization from you. So I've learned that you also work almost completely remotely. Is it?
Yeah, that's correct, Marta. So that's nice to hear. Thank you. I feel like we are quite innovative in some of the things we do, and one of those things is that we are pretty much all remote pretty much all the time. So as everyone's aware, for the past, pretty much all of this year, that's been the case. But usually, when things are business as usual, we have, a few of us out of this big team. There are typically like a couple or a few of us in the offices in London a couple of times per day. So we do a lot of remote working. We're stretched from kind of central time in the United States. So kind of like, and we have some people in Chicago, all the way over to the Middle East. So we're across 6 or 7 different countries, more or less building 2 companies at once, working as a remote team. So it's quite fun. We've learned the challenges, to say the least, firsthand, and we've been doing that for about the past 5 or 6 years now. But we've also learned where there are opportunities for teams to take advantage of working remotely. So yeah, it's been a good journey, and we do have a great team along the ride.
So since many of us were not used to collaborate remotely before the pandemic, I just wanted to ask you, like, on a typical day of a remote worker, what do you do? So what does your routine look like?
Yeah.
Is there anything that you do to avoid getting crazy in front of the screen, or?
Yeah, I think so, or at least I hope so. I sometimes feel I'm going a bit crazy, but there are a couple of things that I learned really that were extremely important, at least for me personally. And you kind of came into one of them, and that's, I think, the first thing you have to learn how to do when you're working remotely is establish some kind of routine, because what tends to happen is your kind of personal life and your professional life kind of merges into one. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, but you can kind of see yourself making the professional a lot more heavy than the personal side. So you'll probably start waking up and checking emails immediately, and you'll say things like, there's only 1 or 2 that are really important. Once I answer those, I'll go into my morning routine and everything will be fine. But then after the second email, you go to the third and the fifth, and your colleagues see you're online, and you start having meetings, and all of a sudden that becomes your routine. It's just waking up and working up until dinner or whatever it may be. So really important to establish a routine, whether that's doing something for an hour before you wake up, or making yourself take lunch breaks, or making yourself walk around the neighborhood, whatever it might be. I think that's important. The second thing that I found myself kind of accidentally getting into, that's typically not a problem in person, is having too many modes of communication. So I've been a little bit better about it now, but a couple of months ago, it was a daily occurrence that I would speak with both clients and my colleagues on WhatsApp, Skype, Zoom, email, iMessage, Slack, different project management tools. And all of a sudden you get in this place where you're spending too much time checking different mediums. And then it's really hard to document the process as well. So when you need to include clients or colleagues in different conversations to see things, you're like, well, that conversation was on Skype. I would like to forward it as an email, but that's a little bit strange. So I think being able to establish as a team how you're going to communicate across which mediums, and then giving yourself a personal routine, are like the really quick ways that you can make remote working a bit easier.
And I think this is a very important point also that we have seen this day with many of our teams who are collaborating in mixed formats. We also are using quite a few tools, but I've seen that so far the teams that are being the most effective are those that just made some decisions, whether it is to have their Zoom room open all the time, whether it is to primarily work on Slack. So I think it's a very valid point to try to reduce the number of inputs that come when you're working remotely. So thanks for the suggestion.
Yeah,
So
great.
I just wanted to show a picture that I saw on your website, again, of your team now all together. Of course, was before the COVID. And you look quite a happy bunch of people. I
Yep.
was just wondering whether there are moments where there are tensions or you feel like you want to throw the computer away and don't see your colleagues anymore. Does it ever happen to you?
No, to be honest, I'm fortunate because I know it's not like this most places, but we have a really, really good team and we gel together quite nicely. And I do think, there's something to be said, and we spend so little time in the office together. I mean, particularly now because of this year, it's always like more or less an exciting feeling. We get to come together and do things. But I think the point is we have really excellent dynamics, and we kind of promote and enable a culture of allowing people to take ownership and finish their projects kind of on their terms and figure out problems how they would like to. And I think when you have that level of autonomy, it really helps to create a more kind of like trusting and inclusive culture, and allows people to work more normally. So that definitely helps. But yeah, I mean, now I'm at the point where I would really love just to see everybody again. That picture was our Christmas party last year. So it would have been like the 15th of December. And that was the last time that any of us were in the office working together. So it's kind of ridiculous when you think about not seeing your colleagues for a year or something like that.
Yeah, it is indeed. When you were talking, I was thinking about what you said about establishing a culture also that is conducive to good dynamics, and also people getting used to rely on each other and be accountable online. Um, so I was thinking, do you believe that you need to have such kind of culture, or is it a responsibility of the organization to foster a climate that is conducive to good dynamics for remote work? Or is it something that other organizations that maybe work more in a traditional format can also progressively learn and import in their organizations? We know now a lot of companies are confronted with these challenges of having to be more used. So how do you feel about that?
Yeah,
Are
no,
organizations born like this, or can they change? Can they?
no, that's a great question, and I think the point you're making is the right one. I think whether it's in a traditional setting or whether it's virtual, obviously having strong leadership is important. I mean, for the well-being of at the organizational level as well as the individual level. I think once you go remote, though, it's almost fundamental to success. I mean, there are things that we can attribute to like individual characteristics of people, and there are things we can attribute to like the organizational level. And I think at the organizational level, it starts with the right leadership. I mean, from the individual and team level. So, doing things like once you're remote, you have to be able to enable a culture of autonomy. You've got to let people get on with their job in the right way. If you get into micromanagement, people are going to get frustrated. Probably the organization will operate a little bit more slowly, and then people will start disconnecting from the cause. And if you have people that are working remotely, obviously, I'm sure this never happens, but obviously people can wake up at 11 a.m. and start working, and they can finish at 3 p.m. And if they don't have that sense of autonomy and they don't feel like they're being trusted to do their job, that they're more susceptible to that happening. I think it's also, again, it's best practice in any kind of organization, but when you're remote, it's also fundamental that you're creating a safe space for your employees or even for your leaders, if you have a manager, to make sure that if we're giving them that autonomy to work freely and get things done kind of on their own time and in their own way, they have to have a safe space to be able to experiment. And I mean, if you want to use the word fail or get things wrong and know that that's okay. There's also a lot more to be said about leaders understanding different kind of working styles. So there are many people who have a much more difficult time working remotely because they do thrive off of the interaction with others. So there are some things you can do, like you mentioned earlier, Marta, like having the Zoom or the Skype open all the time, even if it's on mute and the video's off. When you want to speak to someone, you can turn the video on and talk and say, I need your help or your advice on something. But understanding those kind of individual and team working styles and figuring out how to enable them successfully is important. And then I think kind of on a macro level, it's much more important to establish purpose, right? So kind of what I was saying at the beginning is to make sure people wake up and they want to do their job and they want to get things finished and they want to move the organization forward. It's much more important that they have a sense of purpose and a sense of like why they're doing what they're doing, or else nothing's going to happen. The managers will have to start micromanaging, and then it's a bad dynamic for both. So I think those are probably the fundamentals on what has to happen for our leaders, leading teams in a remote environment.
Right. So we talk a bit about now what organizations should do, but I was also curious to know what you think about remote workers. Like, does it take to have something special to be a good remote workers, or can all of us learn to be good online collaborators?
I think definitely everyone can learn to work well remotely. Obviously, different people have a preference for different ways of working. So I think in the individual, it's just important to figure out, have the humility to say, I understand what works well for me and what doesn't. If I need to be around more people, I need to figure out a way to spend more time with my team, even if it's indirectly. So again, always having the video conferencing tool on and being able to speak with people when you need to, or, for the people who are more introverted, who are more comfortable, it's about figuring out how they can be more involved with their teammates on the day-to-day. But in any case, I think that everyone can figure out how to make remote working work for them, even if it's something as extreme as being remote all the time like we are now.
Right. So where do you see the potential for remote collaboration for companies? Do you think it's worthwhile to explore this opportunity more, or is it something more for COVID times?
So I think there's a lot of upside to remote working. There are obviously some things that I think are much more difficult to get finished. But as far as, will this trend kind of continue? I think absolutely, yes. I don't know if it will continue to be people working 100% remotely all the time. I think that could be extreme, but there are all kinds of things that companies can do now that everything's virtual, so to speak. I mean, one of the things that we had to evaluate when we were building Sprintbase is we run all kinds of virtual projects and we do virtual trainings and virtual design sprints. And at one point we kind of had to step back and redefine what the office meant to us, because once the office isn't like a physical construct anymore and it becomes virtual, there are so many more possibilities. So if we think about it in terms of, where you all are and where I am, technically speaking, my office can be anyone in this time zone. So I can have people in Tennessee and in Toronto and in Brazil. And there's no difference for us working on a project because they're all virtual anyway. Or when you all are in Austria or Milan or London, when you're trying to include people on projects going all the way down to South Africa, is the same kind of office in the construct of in the digital sense. So I think for organizations, they have so much more potential to access more or better talent, right? Or it's a lot easier to include the right people in different kinds of projects, because now that we're remote, there's a lot easier ways to have accessibility to more of our colleagues or subject matter experts when we need their help, or more of our clients when we're looking to build empathy and understand their challenges. It's a lot easier to kind of get out of our physical space and engage those people. So I definitely think there's a lot more potential to be explored, and that companies are starting to learn where there are the pros and where there are the cons. So I don't really see it going away as an overall strategy for organizations.
So this leads a bit to my next question. So I took a couple of screenshots from things that we have seen a lot on the news in the past months. So the first is an article from the Financial Times with the claim that we've also seen on a lot of titles. So is the office dead or is it not?
Oh, good question. Good question. Listen, I don't think The Office is dead, and I mean, to be completely honest, I don't. How do you say this? I don't think The Office will ever be dead, and I don't mean that in the sense of like traditional office space, because I don't know. But what we learned from our experience in doing this stuff remotely over the past 5 years is that there are just some things that you cannot replicate from being in person, right? I mean, when we set out designing Sprintbase, one of the biggest principles we had was how do we? I mean, I can see that the bullet point now. It was like replicate in-person magic. That's what we want to do. We want to take all the in-person innovation workshops we do and make it just as magical online. And after several months, even a couple of years of doing that, we learned how many things work equally as good online, how many things are way better online that will never change, and then we learned how many things that were just better in person. Even if you can do them online, they're a little bit better in person. And a lot of that was just having the human to human dynamic, being able to like sit at a table and do things a lot more dynamically and not miss out on so much of the nuance and different things like that. So as I think that kind of interaction will always be valuable for people, I think that there will always be in some sense room for the office or some room for physical interaction.
Yeah, and this also leads us to also the next question. Here I put some picture from a kind of design thinking environment that we have here in Austria. So at one of our company partners place. We also see on the picture, we have also one of the participants of this session in front of me, actually Eric. Maybe he doesn't know, I took this picture a couple of years ago. He's trying to remember now when that was exactly. So this was a meeting for the setup of InnoSchool, so 2 or 3 years ago already. And so I just wanted to share. So this is how it would normally be, right? In a kind of studio setting, when you have your tools, you have your whiteboards, you have the people that talk together, whiteboards, so the energy. And then we came to Sprintbase. So here's the workspace, one of our team's workspace actually. And you see that there are still the deliverables that our teams are working on. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how Sprintbase started and how you went from having something that is so also sensitive and like face-to-face and kind of nuanced process as the one of the design thinking to have the idea that you could actually do it virtually. And you could do it virtually using a platform like Sprintbase is.
Sure. Yeah, really good question. So the first part is kind of how Sprintbase. And so I think as I touched on earlier, Sprintbase was created by an innovation company called Treehouse Innovation. So overall, our company is called Treehouse, and Sprintbase is one of the products. And at Treehouse, we help companies to create new innovative products and services, and we also help companies to build their own innovation culture. So we do a lot of workshops, like what was just on the screen. We do a lot of strategic design sprints, different training and leadership programs and things like that. And where Sprintbase came along is we kept coming up against a couple of roadblocks that I'm sure everyone here is really familiar with. And one of the biggest ones that's particularly relevant now is, how do you help teams who are just now learning design thinking or innovation principles? How do you help them to turn around and apply that well? Or in other words, what's next after the workshop? We just did this awesome workshop. We've learned great skills, mindsets, habits. How do we apply them? And too many times, as again, most people here will know, is after the workshop, things kind of, hit a wall or kind of go downhill. And too often we get in touch and say like, what's going on, what happened, why is the project stalling? And we'd hear things like, in the design thinking process, we're not really comfortable with interviewing, because interviewing is unfamiliar or it's difficult if you're unfamiliar with it, or we forgot how to form really good insights, or how do you create a prototype for an experience, because experiences aren't tangible. We just need that guidance. And the next question we'd ask is, well, what are you using to run these design thinking workshops and projects with your team now that you're out of the workshop, you're remote again, so you're working across countries, or maybe you're working in the same building but different floors? How are you connecting around these projects? And we'd always hear the same thing, and it's the same thing, that the same tools we're using now. So we'd hear things like, we're using Microsoft Teams to facilitate our design project, or we're using, there are all kinds of whiteboarding tools. We're using some kind of whiteboard with Trello and Skype, and all kinds of different incredible tools, but tools that weren't built around the design thinking process. So then, longer story short, we set out to solve that. How do we help teams, particularly remote teams, to stay on track or run really good innovation projects without needing the expert in the room at all times? So that's how Sprintbase was created. And some of the things that we've seen work really, really, really well, if we're talking about how did we bring kind of the nuance and the complexities of in-person workshops into virtual, is we learned that there are a few things that remote teams have that are advantages over being in person. So some of the kind of like high-level obvious ones are not having to fly people from across the world to land in one place for like 2 days, right? Or now that we're virtual, there's so much more room to access your customers or your clients, right? People nowadays are really comfortable using Zoom or Skype or any kind of web conferencing medium, where it's not uncommon to say like, hey, Marta, can we have a 10-minute interview? I want to talk about your experience with InnoDays, and let's talk about how you use Sprintbase. And I can build empathy with you really quickly and easily, instead of waiting for you to be in an in-person workshop. We also have a lot more flexible teams and timeframes. So as we're not in a 1-day or 2-day workshop, we can stretch these projects to run over 2 weeks or even 2 months. So we're allowing the team more flexibility in time frame, which is enabling more valuable voices to get heard. We can include people in the innovation process. We can bring them out as subject matter experts when we need them to, and ensure that the right people are in the room, so to speak, the virtual room at the same time. We've also had a lot of success working with people that have more introverted ways of working, where they might be overlooked or might not have the time to process information in a workshop. When they have 2 or 3 days to kind of reflect on what they're learning and think, it gives them a lot more power to do better work. And then one of the big things that I liked on the slides that you've shown, if Thomas, if you're on the slides, if you go back 2 slides to show the workshop, one of the things we like is what you can see that I've always had the job of doing is all the sticky notes on the flip chart. And one of the worst things to do is, after running a really big, incredible strategic, design project or program, is someone has to scribe and document all of that stuff. So then, Thomas, if you flip forward to the next one, when we're using Sprintbase, at any point in the innovation process, you can click a button and it downloads all the data into a PDF. So we've been able to do things like, we'll send teams out to do interviews, their interview clients, they'll capture the key learnings into the platform, they'll generate the output document and then send it to everyone in the organization or the entire product team, for example. And now you can say, click of a button, you can let the product team see exactly what you're learning from your clients. So those are some of like the big things we've learned that are kind of better in the remote setting, if you will. But there's obviously room to do things well, both in in-person workshops and virtually.
And I think you raised a lot of great points also that we are seeing here during these days. A lot of our teams today have conducted interviews, and they have conducted interviews with people literally everywhere, even with my mother, some of them. So it was quite incredible compared to when you are in a physical room and you feel like you need to get your customer outside the room, that you can think in virtual terms and think about expanding your reach and finding customers that maybe you can access through other types of tools, and maybe digital tools as well. So
Right.
yeah, I think it's a great point. I was just wondering maybe to have some more concrete examples of what kind of customers you work with. Is there maybe any project that you could explain to us, and so that we get a sense of what's Sprintbase good for in particular?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to. So typically at Treehouse, we help our clients to do a few things. Like generally when we're having the conversation, the problems we're looking to solve are, clients get in touch and say, we need to solve a really complex problem. That can be supply chain, that can be, redesigning a clinical trials process for a pharmaceuticals company, that can be improving our product development process or figuring out what features on apps that our customers really like. So really complex and urgent problems. We also do a lot of work on building internal innovation capabilities. So helping teams who are non-experts to first understand kind of the principles and the fundamentals of design thinking, but most importantly for them to develop new mindsets and new habits so that they can have better, creative ways of problem solving. We also, with that, we do a lot of work with leaders. So as we kind of spoke about earlier in working remotely, we work with leaders to help them to kind of be able to identify and enable and reward the right mindset so that we're actually setting a culture of innovation in the organization so that we can continue building momentum and really make change at scale. And we use Sprintbase to do all of that stuff. So historically it's been in person, but now it's Sprintbase. I mean, if we take a look at a couple of projects, we get to work with a lot of big pharmaceuticals companies. Right now we have a couple of projects going on with big pharma companies, helping them to redesign the clinical trials process. And that's, kind of never been more urgent than it is now with the problems we're facing. We recently worked with the fastest growing energy company in Europe, where they kind of had two challenges, and it was all done remotely. They said, on one side, we want to be the best place to work in Europe. And on the other side, we have some really strategic priorities to reduce the churn rate across our customers. We were helping them to run those projects remotely. We obviously get to support the InnoDays program, which we've had fun doing for the past several months. That's really been great. We are wrapping up one of our most exciting projects we're doing, that is helping an entity to design the smart home of the future. So that's like really getting into the weeds of looking 5 and 10 and 20 years in the future. And all of these projects have been done 100% online. So we've learned that we're able to take what we're doing in person and do it really, really well online, just by kind of changing up a few of the methods and leveraging the power of the platform.
Maybe it's worth mentioning, since I know that we also have some of our university partners here, that Sprintbase is also working with a lot of universities, and it's also been a lifesaver for a lot of people like us who work with students and work with design thinking. And ourselves, we're not even thinking that one day this could be online. So we got great coaching on how we could also customize the platform and try to fit it to our style of running design thinking processes, which I think is very important for people who are facilitating this kind of processes, because everyone has their own kind of take on how the process should look like. So I think that's been a very empowering tool to have something that understands the logics, but still it's flexible enough to accommodate slightly different versions and styles. So something I was wondering, since I'm one of the people who ran to you in search of answers during the pandemic, when we didn't know whether we could run our event online, and we were doing demos all the days of a lot of tools. So what changed during the pandemic for you? Did you see more people coming to you with different needs? How did your spring look like?
Oh gosh, yeah. It definitely changed. I mean, gosh, we've got to realize so many different things. I think you could almost look at it in phases. I mean, when the pandemic first took off, and a lot of people who had never experienced remote working before were, as we call it, suddenly remote. Like we had people suddenly remote. The first kind of ask, whether it was using Sprintbase or getting advice on what it's like to run virtual teams, the first ask or the typical inquiry would be, I need to use the platform to take everything I've been doing in person and I need to move it online, right? That's just like kind of the intuitive kind of shell-shocked approach. I'm used to running one-day workshops. I'm used to running 5-day sprints. I need to move it online. And it didn't take long for people to understand that that's like a really, really bad idea. I mean, if I don't know if anyone's ever had to go through it, but doing like an entire Monday on Zoom, for example, like 8 hours straight, it just doesn't work. I mean, it's too hard to engage people. They've got their entire life right behind the facilitator, so to speak, where they can just check emails or they can work on other projects, whatever it may be. So it was really hard for people to understand. You can do everything that you're used to doing in person online. That's possible. You just can't do it in the same way. So for the first several weeks or couple of months, that was the conversation. And we were helping people to do things like take a 2-day sprint that you would be doing 2 days on a Monday, Tuesday in person, and make that a 2-week sprint where you're getting together on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and you're allowing the team to do both synchronous working, where we're together like we are now, kind of talking through how to build empathy and who we're going to interview, and then asynchronous working, where we're actually conducting the interviews and synthesizing them and getting on the platform. So helping teams to really understand that dynamic and move it online. And then I think what we've seen now that we've been several months into it is that pretty much everyone is digitally fluent, right? There aren't many people now who aren't accustomed to using video conferencing every single day. People know how to administer different kind of virtual events. They're comfortable using the video and the chat function and the whiteboard feature that's built in. And because there is so much more fluency in that, the next ask has kind of been getting teams and organizations set up to do this kind of work indefinitely. So a lot of people have understood kind of the pros and cons, like Marta, you and Thomas. I'm sure you have a lot of ways you learned in the past 6 months. This actually works better in person. And you have a lot of things that say, this works better virtually, I probably won't change it. And because more organizations are realizing that, the next kind of question is, these are the things we've identified, particularly for our strategy and innovation work that we want to keep remote. Can you help us to put the infrastructure in place using Sprintbase so that we can continue running these innovation projects remotely successfully?
Right. One thing that I was wondering is whether you observe like some common trends in terms of what kind of struggle these companies had in getting into this logic. Did you find the same type of resistances across different organizations, or was it kind of everyone a case separate from the other?
Oh, that's a good question. It's been different. I mean, I think there are a couple of ways you can split it up. I think it's definitely industry specific, right? So there are a lot of sectors and industries that are more accustomed to working remotely, or at least have a lot more fluency in digital tools. So the conversation there and helping them bring things online are different. And then you have more kind of traditional industries where being fluent in digital tools and working remotely, or having at least flexible working where sometimes you're not in person, is a lot more foreign. So those conversations look a lot different. We've also had to do, as you mentioned earlier, we've done a ton of work with universities and particularly individual professors. We love it. It's been great. And helping them to reimagine, what does this look like now that I have to take my entire curriculum online? I mean, especially in the United States, it's been an absolute mess here, as everyone knows. And helping them to have the conversation about, how do I help my students to understand and learn design thinking and entrepreneurship and lean and agile thinking? How do I help them to do this? But now that we're remote, and this is typically a very hands-on kind of application-based competency, how can we do that and really help that to stick? So helping them to kind of integrate their curriculum into Sprintbase and run these projects in synchronous and asynchronous sessions has been a different conversation. And then we get to do a lot of work with other consulting companies who have said, we realize now that a lot of the future is digital. I don't know if it's all remote or all virtual, but a lot of it is digital. We think now is a good opportunity to get back to the drawing board and to reevaluate our services and kind of redesign them. And we want a lot of that to be virtual. So we help these consultancies to kind of leverage the different tools that we use, including Sprintbase, to create their new services so that they can have kind of more innovative offerings once all of this is over.
Great. So I know now we've been talking for a while, so I'm just getting towards the end because I can see that there are some questions coming in already. What I wanted to ask as a kind of towards the end of our conversation is, where do you see the future of remote collaboration going? So hopefully we will get over this hectic period with the COVID. How do you think our ways of working will be transformed by this experience?
Oh man, yeah, gosh, it's hard to say. I mean, I think there are tons and tons of things we can do better, and a lot of potential, and a lot of that is stuff that we can't see, or at least I can't see. That's for sure. But there are a couple of things just from my experience that I know have worked well and haven't. So, you know, some of the things that maybe I touched on a little bit earlier, but kind of being remote does a lot for allowing teams to have more flexible ways of working, both when they're finishing tasks and the access they have to other people when they're running through projects. So we've had so much success running projects remotely where we're able to engage stakeholders that we would not be able to engage if we were in person. Like if we were in an in-person workshop, we wouldn't be able to have, if we're sitting in London, we wouldn't be able to just instantly engage clients or colleagues in India and in South Africa and in France, and then quickly be able to share what we learned across teams. So I think that has a lot. I also think the accessibility to talent is a big trend we're seeing. Like we're already seeing this with the major tech companies in California who have pretty much said we're going to continue working remotely and you can go live where you want. And then the second phase of that is, now that they've sent their employees to live where they want, there's now no difference, as I was saying earlier, between the talent in San Francisco and the talent in Brazil. If someone's equally as talented and they're a lot cheaper or they're a lot more experienced or whatever it may be, there is no difference if we're all on the same playing field. So I think that trend will continue to go. And then of course, being able to leverage tools a lot more efficiently. So one of the things that really changed my world is I now use, I mean, it can be any kind of tool, but I use Asana to document absolutely everything I'm doing, from like leaving notes for myself for what I need to do the next day, or client correspondence, or anything I learned from my colleagues, anything like that. So I trust now the technology, where I've put everything that I need to know inside the technology, which means I have a lot more bandwidth to think about what work needs to be done instead of trying to remember what needs to be done. And I think there's a lot more potential for us to continue leveraging tools in that way to create better remote working styles and better teams.
Yeah, and I think you raised some important points also for our participants, who are some of them in the age also looking for work. Don't underestimate remote work. I think you are a success story for me, because you live in one of the coolest places in the world, which happens to be my hometown or home city. I wouldn't call it a town. Yeah, I would encourage also our participants, our students, not to think that those are opportunities that are of Series B, that are less good than being in person. I think there are also opportunities to learn and to be part of an organization also when this organization is actually distributed.
Yeah, absolutely.
So do we have any question? I cannot see the chat too well from here, maybe for age, but also for size of the fonts. So maybe someone can help me reading the questions. I can see some there.
Let me see, Marta.
It's Thomas who has a question. How do here is it. So how do you suggest to deal with a situation where a team just gets to know each other at the InnoDays and 2 team members are virtual and 2 are in the same room?
Sure. Yep, that's a really good question, and it was something that we had to learn the hard way because we ran into the challenges that I think Thomas is alluding to, and it's almost like creating sub teams within a team based on comfort or familiarity, and that's difficult. One thing we do as a best practice, Thomas, is anytime we're doing something virtual, even if it's like, it's one team in New York and one team in London, and in both offices there are 3 people together. One thing we do is we make everyone have their own computer or their own screen. So if you have 3 people in New York and 3 in Milan, and you're all in the same conference room, we say, look, this is great, but we want each one of you to have your own individual screen, just to make sure we're not excluding anyone should there be an individual who's left out, or that we're not kind of segmenting the team in 2. So best practice is definitely to encourage or force, if you want, but highly encourage that each individual in the team is always working on their own workspace and on their own medium, just to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah, that's great. Although we have seen it's not always very easy. So I think it's an effort that we all should try to make, not to end up ignoring people who are online, and try to create the same experience for everyone.
Definitely.
So we have a question from Andrea from Romberg. She's asking, how does this work to work on the mindset online? How are you able to have that change in ways of working, culture in the organization when you actually are very seldom together?
Sure.
How do you get the shift?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I'm admittedly not the best person to ask because I don't have 10 years working in an office. So admittedly, when all this happened, there wasn't a huge shift for me, but I do know that we were not used to working all online all the time. So there are a couple of things I can speak to. One in kind of the macro sense, and one on the project sense. I think on the macro sense, one of the things we figured out early is as soon as we were all online all the time, we had to completely redesign our meeting frequency and who was involved in what meetings. Because one of the most difficult things about working online, particularly if you're working in a fast-paced environment, where you're a startup or you're working on a lot of innovation projects, is you learn so much when you're in person in the, as we can say, the water cooler conversations. Just kind of you're not talking about anything really, but you just stop in someone's office to talk and you end up doing strategy. And when you're remote, that doesn't happen. It's kind of counterintuitive to say, I'm just going to call someone on Skype just to pick their brain a little bit, because it needs to be much more formal. So one thing we did is we made sure that we were having a lot more stand-up meetings. Short duration, but very frequent. So I have tons of meetings with my small team throughout the week, and they may only be 10 or 15 minutes, but it's just to cover what happened, in the first half of the day, so that we aren't losing those water cooler conversations and those nuance. And once you do that, it kind of puts people in a better mindset that this is still a team, it's still inclusive, we're all on the right track all the time. On the project sense, one thing that we like to do whenever we're kicking off innovation projects is we will always have a pretty long 60 minutes, 90 minutes, 2 hours kickoff call to kind of establish objectives. And being able to kind of set the tone is a good way to get people in the right mindset and make sure that we're all on the same page before progressing through a project. So those are a couple of things that I would say work well when you're trying to make the shift from being in person to being suddenly remote.
Right. I'm just checking the chat. It keeps going. We have actually a question from one of our teams. So Thomas was triggering some question about the challenges that they're facing right now. And I can see that one team is struggling with keeping everybody concentrated, updated, make sure that they get the information. So what kind of advice would you give to this team? They are working really now very intensively since yesterday evening. So it's a lot of screen time.
Yeah, that is really hard. That was one of the problems that I ran into personally, again, like when I was using so many different modes of communication is because the communication was scattered amongst colleagues and clients. I wasn't able to easily update people with visibility. So one of the things that we do now is in our task management and our client relationship management tools, we keep all of our correspondence in one place. So if it's, anything related to InnoDays, whether it's a conversation I had with Marta and Thomas, or it's an idea we had, or it's feedback, it all lives in one place. That way, instead of me having the knowledge and me having it in different mediums, if anyone in my team from Chicago to India wants to understand anything that's going on at InnoDays, they know it lives in one place. So this is a really good way to make sure people are staying engaged and they're on track and they have the right information at the right time, rather than needing to just stay on video all the time and dump information.
And I think if I can also comment on this, like we have also assigned our participants to separated Slack channels.
Yep.
I think one thing that you should know is that we are not forcing you to be together all the time, working together all the time and not taking breaks. So it's okay if some of us go for a walk and one maybe talks with the mentor or ask a question to a mentor, but it's good practice maybe to attract a conversation with the mentor within the team channel, so that when the other team members come back from the walk, then they find the information in their team space, so they know that it's there and you don't need to talk to them to update on what you talk about with the mentor. So I think there are a couple of tricks that you can learn on being a bit smart and make sure that there are not informations in emails, informations in calls, information in someone's WhatsApp, but make sure that you have one place where all the work and the information is stored. Also, that happens maybe on an individual basis.
Yeah.
So I see that we get another question about prototyping in a virtual space.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a tricky question sometimes for those who are used to work with stuff like me. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, it is tricky. That's one of those things where it's like, it's really, really hard to replicate, or maybe it's impossible to replicate having someone sitting in front of you, but there are some things you can do. I mean, one of the things we like to do is first give people something interactive. So if we're talking about in the context of Sprintbase, I think people are aware when you're in the prototype stage in Sprintbase, you can create a prototype note and you can share that exact note with someone. And what's really helpful, particularly if you're trying to communicate something a bit more complex, is to make a video, right? So record yourself for 30 seconds speaking about what you want to happen, or even if you can, do a role play, kind of act out what an experience would look like, imagining it. Or if you have some kind of physical prototype, you could show yourself using it and talk about the different things you want to do to make it better or to solve a certain problem. And giving people that kind of context sometimes can be a lot easier than just looking at a piece of paper, for example. So I think if you want to be a little bit more interactive in sharing digital prototypes, try to bring it to life more by doing things like role play or interacting with something physical, recording it and sending it along for feedback.
And I think that's really good points. And also to remind people that it's not either or. So you're still allowed to do things in the physical space. So maybe two of you are somewhere, you can work together on something, you can share, or you can kind of get creative on your own with things that you have available in your own space, and then you share it through the platform. But using or doing work virtually doesn't mean that you are only restricted to the virtual experience itself. So I think that's important to keep in mind, that we still live in a physical space. So it's good to be mindful about that.
Yeah, great point.
So I think we are getting really towards the end. We only have 5 minutes left. Do we have any other questions? I have some issues reading. Any advice for presenting your prototype in a video call effectively in terms of your stage presence?
Ooh.
Wow.
I've only done this kind of in like a sophisticated manner one time, Thomas. And the way I did it is I kind of set it back like I was on a stage. I mean, more or less trying to set it up how Marta is now, where I've kind of stepped back and then I take the person through the experience. So I still feel like I'm doing a presentation and I'm giving people something more concrete than, for example, just seeing my slides or just seeing my storyboards or just seeing a picture of my prototype, but rather I try to do some kind of interaction. So again, that's doing role play, or that's coming up here and actually drawing and taking people through the experience. If there's some kind of more back and forth to get them engaged. I think you can also work to do it backwards. So to both questions, like getting feedback on prototypes or presenting, you can also ask people in their physical space to interact with you, right? So if I had some prototype of an experience, for example, I could ask Marta, like, this is what I think the experience is going to be. Can you act it out? How does that feel? What's uncomfortable? Is there any like immediate feedback you give me to improve it? And you can just make the back and forth a bit more interactive, just like if we were all sitting in the same workshop or conference room.
Right, so final question. If teams are really tired from collaborating online for all day, how should they recharge to keep going?
Oh yeah, this is hard. I think one of the like disconnects here that I found is when you get tired of working remotely or let's say working, your first thing to disconnect is say that you want to do something. You want to watch Netflix, or you want to I don't know, play a video game or something. But at the end, you're still kind of staring at a screen and getting the same exhaustion, which is kind of counterintuitive to what you think. So when I get really tired of staring at the screen or doing anything in a remote sense, I always go outside. I go for a walk, or I go play sports or whatever it is, but something that doesn't involve me staring at technology. So I'd say once you get tired, get away from tech, like detox yourself from tech and do something a bit more traditional.
Right. So for all the participants, once you have completed your tasks on Sprintbase, not before, you are advised and you get also Ryan's permission to get out and get some fresh air, get some food, and come back energized. So to conclude, we have a beautiful drawing here from Dennis that summarizes our conversation. I don't know if you can see it, Ryan.
No, that's beautiful.
It's here.
Yeah,
now
great.
it should be down, but I don't want to make a mess. So we would send you also a digital version. So we have all the key points for you summarized there. And then I also wanted to make a bit of promotion. So I've seen that you're also running a spotlight series on how to take your remote innovation work to the next level. So very relevant and also very in line with what we are trying to do here. So I would encourage anyone who is interested in this topic to sign up, check out Sprintbase work, Ryan's work, and thank you very much for joining us at the InnoDays.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Marta. Thanks a lot. This has been fun.